And yes, as director of CORTH, as I said, I'm really happy that we have Katie come and talk to us, because Katie's concerns have for a long time been about reproduction, but also, extending that to reproduction and environmental sort of concerns. And she has been, working as an anthropologist of right through her undergraduate and PhD work at LSE, and Katie is now based at the University of Cambridge as a senior research associate in the, which is a senior researcher really at the Department of Sociology. But she's also deputy director alongside Sarah Franklin, who's director of the Reproductive Sociology Research Group, ReproSoc, and we'd like to see it as a linked sister kind of institution. So yes, we are very pleased to have Katie come and talk to us about her work, both within the anthropology of reproduction, and then of course within the anthropology and sociology of reproduction. Katie has written some fantastic work. So in 2016, she wrote a book which was coming out of, I think, your doctoral work, Katie, which was, and it's called Making a Good Life, an ethnography of nature, ethics, and reproduction. And I can say it's very accessible to read and really very interesting. It was brought out by Princeton University Press. And more recently, she has edited a volume with Victoria Boydell called Nature and Ethics Across Geographical, Rhetorical, and Human Borders. I love your titles. That's coming out with, or it's come out with Routledge. So without more ado, I would like to invite Katie to take us through her journey for today, which is telling us about conditional fertility, but looking at this in the context of multi-species kinship, care, and community again amongst London seed savers. Thanks, Katie. And this is very much research in progress, as I understand. So yes, thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Maya. It's really nice to be here and to meet you all and to share some of what I've been doing recently. Thank you to Maya very much for inviting me today, and Sophie for organising. So I'll start with a bit of background, which probably seems especially necessary when it's a slightly sort of non-obvious topic like this, which is what I seem to specialise in. So I work, as Maya said, as part of the part of ReproSoc. Just moving your faces. Can you see the bottom thing now? As part of this Wellcome Trust collaborative award called Changing Infertilities. And it's really just looking at how perceptions of and behaviours around fertility and infertility have changed essentially since assisted reproductive technologies became available, but more broadly in the kind of contemporary moment. And as part of that, I am working on a work package called Infertile Environment. And the kind of key question of that is this one that I've highlighted in yellow: what are the conditions of possibility for biological, social and cultural reproduction in a time of global environmental crisis? And this builds on my previous work on reproduction and the environment, which Maya's kindly just mentioned. And also it's something, this area I think is something that is gaining traction and awareness in reproductive studies, and also in conversely in environmental studies and social science more generally, not surprisingly, considering that it's now uncontroversial to talk of this time as a time of ecological, environmental and climate crisis. Guiding framework for me in this work is that of environmental reproductive justice, which, as you may know, is comes out of community-based participatory research, particularly amongst Native American communities. And Elizabeth Hoover has been a really important scholar in this area who's really articulated this, as she does in this quote here. And she makes this point about how people, place and culture are interconnected, and how problems in the environment often work themselves out in problems of reproduction. This framework is also very relevant to my work on seed saving, because, as you will probably know, that's also a very important area of activism with Native American communities, although obviously there are some differences between people in London and the kind of communities that Elizabeth Hoover works with. There are actually some quite similar motivations and sympathies in terms of why people save seeds. So I approach my research through an ERJ framework that considers humans to be interconnected with each other, their environments and other species, which focuses on the conditions of possibility for biological, social and cultural reproduction. And importantly, this is a framework that focuses on the lived experiences and unequal distribution of environmental injustice and degradation, rather than ideas of what some generalized humanity does to the planet. So I'm very much working against any kind of populationist ideas, but also I very much believe in the sort of feminist and decolonial critiques of the Anthropocene concept, which we can talk about more later if you want to. It's a whole big topic to get into right at the moment, but just to sort of give you a bit of background of where I'm coming from. So although the reproduction that I'm going to be talking about today is that of plants, I hope that by thinking about ideas like breeding, saving seeds, pollination and selection, that you will agree with me that gardening and growing food is actually a process of multi-species reproduction. Also, as someone who has a solid background in reproduction and kinship studies, I've noticed how ideas about relatedness, care and community really permeate the seed saving world. Indeed, you could argue that the ethic of seed saving is consciously and deliberately aimed at care, and that this is in explicit contrast to the perception of seed savers that commercial seed companies don't have any interest in relations other than those of production and in profit. So I've been doing what you might call, if you wanted to give it a formal title, slow ethnography over several years. I started working on this project originally probably about 5 years ago, and was originally looking at seed swapping events around the country, and then decided to focus in on London. And I'm sure you'll know that seed swapping is pretty big in Brighton. So I've visited Seedy Sunday in Brighton quite a few times. So I initially was doing research in person for obvious reasons. It's been online for the last year or so, which has its benefits and limitations, another thing we can discuss later if you want to. Today I'm going to focus particularly on London Freedom Seed Bank, which is a small voluntary organisation sharing seeds and knowledge about how to save them with food growers and community gardens in London. So my basic, hopefully sort of deceptively simple research question is, why do people in London save seeds? So why do they save, share and swap seeds rather than buying them from commercial providers? And here I've listed some of the main reasons, and of course for some people it will just be one of these reasons, and for others it will be a mixture, and again it might depend on which particular seed you're talking about. Something that's important to note though is that they're not especially interested in heritage or heirloom seeds, which might be familiar from other work on seed saving in other locations. And they tend to be much more interested in flavour, productivity, abundance, as well as plants that do well in the local conditions of London. And this is something I'm going to talk about more. So let's dive into a bit of data. So something that's emerged as a key theme in the research is the interrelationship between place, plants and people. And this can be seen in these three kind of sub-themes. So the idea of doing well in tough conditions, similarly, and these all overlap with each other, adapting to local conditions, and then fostering diversity and biodiversity. So I'm going to just take you through these three themes based in some data. So I've chosen a deliberately tongue-in-cheek representation of London here. I'm sure I don't need to explain London to most of you. Probably some of you are in London like me at the moment. But just to sort of play with perceptions a bit, of course, from the outside, London might seem like a strange place to study people doing grassroots seed activism and food growing, but of course it's also somewhere with a lot of green space, and in fact where growing food is really important for lots of different reasons. Something that has emerged in interviews and conversations with seed savers is the conditions of growing food in London as a particularly prevalent theme. So here we have Julie and Richard, who are both on the steering group of the London Freedom Seed Bank. Although Julie's actually since left because she's moved, but she was at the time. So Richard talks about the lack of space and how that means less control over cross-pollination between plants or between varieties, and how this creates a unique situation in which the standard rules don't necessarily apply. While Julie mentions the variety of people and plants in London, which she describes using words like incredible, beautiful, and exciting. And you could sort of present this in the following typology, categorized into limitations and opportunities. So the limitations are things like small spaces that most people have, if they have any space to grow in London, the soil conditions, the climatic conditions, and the shade, which is also created by building density, and then things like access to growing space in the first place and how that's related to expense. And then on the other side of the coin, the opportunities are that they identify are the diverse human population, and with that different plant varieties. And then with that, a sense of community, and even Julie suggested a potential for greater care. So I'm going to sort of build on this as I go through. So in terms of seeds, one of the motivations for saving seeds in London, which, as I've said, is slightly different from other seed saving communities, is an interest in saving, conserving, and cultivating plants that do well in London's conditions. And this is a practical consideration for individual gardeners, as Charlotte, one of London Freedom Seed Bank's co-directors, articulates here. She talks about how you're really supposed to only save seeds from really successful crops, because otherwise you're carrying genetic weakness forward to the next generation. And so seed saving, can help us identify which crops really do well here and which ones make sense to be growing in London. It's also a more planetary or ecological consideration, as we see in the words of fellow co-director of the Seed Bank, Helena, who in this very recent article says that in the context of a rapidly changing climate, it's really important that we're growing stuff that's best suited to our area and best suited to adapt to these continually changing circumstances. But of course, it's not just that plants have a simple relationship with their environments or only exist in nature. Mediating this relationship are people, and with that, human histories, ideologies, and cultures. So as noted, my research participants are not especially interested in heirloom seeds, and this relates to their awareness of the growing conditions of London. But it also relates to their belief that London seeds need not be native seeds, so they don't believe in a conception of place, home, or environment that's based in long histories, traditions, or claims to longevity, but the ability to adapt and do well. So if we come back to Charlotte's comment about selecting for seeds that do well in London's conditions and add in some context here, as in what she said before that, we see her awareness that London and the UK have a long history of movement of people and plants. Indeed, as you may know, the term diaspora comes originally from the Greek for scatter or sow. So here we see Charlotte linking the fact that such movement is characteristic of London with her idea of which crops make sense to grow in London, being those that do well in the specific conditions here. And this belief can be read in several ways. It could be read as a sort of survival of the fittest discourse, and that wouldn't be all that surprising coming from those of my participants who have some training in botany and genetics, and Charlotte is herself a professional gardener. It can also be read as a horticulturally inflected version of the story that Londoners like to tell about their city, that it's a diverse place in which there's something for everyone, and you can be whoever you want to be, and you don't necessarily have to have the ties of birth or lineage to feel a sense of belonging. So, for example, Patrick, a seed saver who grew up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, told me how moving to London in his 30s had helped him feel comfortable with his identity as a gay man, and how gardening, which reminded him of growing up on his parents' smallholding, helped him to recover from mental health and addiction issues. But as Patrick freely admitted, diversity isn't celebrated by everyone, and in this quote, Charlotte gestures towards an awareness of London's history of migration and the diasporas of both people and foods that are, of course, also closely related to the city and the country's colonial history. And this brings us on to people. So since I first thought about this project, I've been particularly interested in the ways in which people think about biodiversity and diversity in humans and how they might think about these together. So coming back to Julie and Richard, in these quotes, we see a common perception amongst white seed savers that immigrants to London bring with them both unusual foods and knowledge about how to grow them and save seeds from them. Julie, who's white but herself a first-generation migrant, describes unusual plants as very London because they reflect the human population, which she describes as varied and complex. While Richard also describes the foods grown in London as reflecting the people. They both also then went on to talk about how these unusual plants do well because London's climate is quite dry, and so plants from warmer and drier climates can thrive here. In this way, they were both celebrating and naturalising the presence and activities of migrant communities within London, whilst retaining a sense of the unusual. So let's pause for a moment and just summarise what I've shown so far. So these are some articulations of this idea of London as a diverse place and London as this diverse people through plants and seeds. So Charlotte said, it's nothing new, us taking on foods from elsewhere and making them part of our culture. And in this way, I think she's trying to express that London seeds are not necessarily native ones, which interestingly complicates the relationship between fertility, origins and heritage. But the other side of that is that she says in order to survive, they have to be strong and to adapt. Julie said, unusual boards are very London. And here I think there's a sort of chain of reasoning of human diversity leads to unusual plants, which leads to more varieties, which leads to greater biodiversity. So there's an interesting thing happening with scale here. And I should say also that, or reiterate that creating conditions for greater biodiversity is a really important motivation for seed savers. And then Richard said, the varieties we're picking, and by that he means selecting rather than picking fruit, reflect many of the long established migrant communities. So with this, I think he's saying that seeds encapsulate their origins, their environment, and their relationships and values in which they're cultivated and saved. So in this way, London seeds are inextricably linked with Britain's colonial and multicultural history and present. So I'm going to round up in a moment with a conceptualisation of conditional fertility, but I'd just like to dwell a moment longer on this idea of diversity. So, of course, this is a hot and contested topic, and in my research, I find Sarah Ahmed's work particularly helpful in understanding the complexities of race, migration, institutional whiteness, diversity work, and how these themes are articulated by seed savers in London. So far, I presented the voices of white middle-class seed savers because that is representative of the leadership of London Freedom Seed Bank, but I don't in any way wish to imply that this is a white activity. And in fact, seed saving is practiced across communities, and I've conducted interviews with several people of colour. Unfortunately, I don't have sufficient time to do this topic justice today, and I've done other talks about it and writing a book chapter about it, and very happy to talk about it more later. But I do just want to invite you to consider these two rather different experiences on the slide here as an indication of what it can mean to be white and middle class versus a working class person of colour when trying to do something like grow food in and with your community in London. In other words, what does diversity mean according to whether you are considered diverse? So on the left, there's a quote from Janie, who's the director of Incredible Edible Lambeth, who's discussing the problem of representation in the leadership levels of these organisations like the one that she runs. And this is something that the co-directors of London Freedom Seed Bank wrestle with too. On the right, we see a comment from an interview that I did with Babu, who's a veteran left-wing and anti-racist campaigner who's been working with his friend and neighbour Simon to grow food from saved seeds on their council estate. When I interviewed him in June last year, it was just a few days after he and Simon had been stopped and searched for the third time that year by the police whilst gardening. So this is a stark contrast clearly, though it's worth noting that Babu and Janie do actually also work together, so they're not exactly moving in different worlds. And I think it's worth mentioning, even if I can't do this whole topic full justice now, because it shows the reality of what it means to be diverse in London and how this collides with the celebratory model of diversity expressed by white seed savers in previous slides. So, coming back to conditions, although it's all been about conditions, hopefully, hopefully you agree. So I'd like to propose a concept that I've been thinking about recently. And as I hope to have shown here, the theme of conditions is a prevalent one in my conversations with seed savers. And conditions is one of those wonderful words that can mean many things at once, which makes it very good to think with. And I do have a bit of a proclivity for words like this, like all my previous work on nature. And I think you can split conditions into these four elements. Limitations, and particularly environmental limitations, so the broader kind of picture of the loss of biodiversity, mass extinction, monocropping, enclosure of the commons and so on, which are all things that seed savers talk about. You can look at it as context or environment to which one adapts and with which one is in a relationship. You can see conditions as bargains that one makes with others, for example, in order to create a harmonious community. And then you can also think about conditions as signifiers of the health, vigour or fertility of something, such as soil, plants and communities. It's probably also worth pausing for a moment with the concept of fertility. Again, one of those terms that has a lot of different meanings and gains a lot of potency through those different meanings. So, for example, if you took a biomedical approach to fertility and infertility, you might treat it as a condition or a capacity, which of course can shift over time for an individual. A demographer, meanwhile, might treat fertility as the product of choices, actions, or perhaps even relationships, as well as the availability or not of particular technologies. While someone who works with plants might think of soil fertility, which is more to do with growth and nutrition, the relationship between individual and environment. And that's different from how we might think of fertility in humans, but I think it's worth sort of thinking across the species divide. So what does conditional fertility do, and can it be applied beyond plants? And as Maya said, this is work in progress, so I'm very happy to and open to hearing your thoughts about this. I think that it can recognise the relational nature of the lived experience of fertility and infertility. So it's considering individuals' relationships with environments in the broadest sense of the term. I think it speaks to a justice framework, moving the focus away from individuals and choices towards infrastructures and systemic inequalities. And I think if we work from the assumption that humans exist in interdependent webs of connection with other species, land and environments, then we can see that conditional fertility is a multi-species concept. And all this returns us to the question I started with: what are the conditions of possibility for biological, social and cultural reproduction in a time of global environmental crisis? So to wrap up, how we think about fertility reflects broader political, moral, economic, social, cultural and ontological assumptions, as I'm sure I don't need to tell you. A broad coalition of ideological influences has led us to think of fertility in the 21st century as something that's freely chosen and optimised by individuals, that can be facilitated or enhanced with technologies, and as something that is more or less desirable in different types of people and other species. Such a view willfully overlooks the interdependence and relationality that makes biological, social and cultural reproduction possible and perhaps meaningful. So fertility is not just something that happens, it's profoundly conditional. Thank you. I think you're on mute, Maya.
Oh, sorry. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Katie. So, we've had actually you've stuck. You've been fantastic on the timing, which gives us all enough time to ask our questions. And I can see at least one London seed saver in the and that's our CORTH member, Paula Baretsa from King's and Sexual Reproductive Health there. And I can yes, and I can see someone, Papreen, who's very interested in fertility and infertility issues from the university, also present, Lucilla, and everyone. So while people are perhaps thinking about questions, just something to start us off on, perhaps, and to ask you, Katie. I mean, I love the way that you're kind of thinking about these, just thinking about fertility in different places and what it does. Places not just in terms of geographical spaces, but in terms of intellectual spaces, and what it's doing in these and I was actually thanks everybody, and we'll see you at the next CORTH meeting. Thank you, Lucilla. Lovely to meet you.